Hi, my name's Jim Giles. I work on the carbon and food programs for Green Biz, and I'm here with Victoria Mills, who is a managing director at EDF. Victoria, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we were just chatting about some of the work that you do with corporates, so why don't you dive into some of that and we can get involved in your thoughts on how that might move things forward on the sustainability fronts.
Sure. So I work at the intersection of sustainability and public policy and working with companies. And, thinking about what Joel was saying in yesterday's plenary session about the evolution of corporate sustainability and how the frontier for leadership has continued to advance. What we've realized, and EDF and other NGOs together, is that it's time to raise the bar for leadership to include climate policy advocacy. We've been really encouraged by the number of companies that are setting ambitious climate goals, committing to use 100% renewable energy, working through their whole supply chain to drive down emissions. And all of those actions are really important. But unless we also have businesses using their voices to advance policies that will drive down emissions at speed and at scale, we're not going to get to net zero by 2050, which is the goal that the IPCC says we have to achieve to limit the worst impacts of climate change.
All right, so can you give us an example of the kind of advocacy that you'd like to see more of?
Back in October, 11 NGOs signed on to an open letter to the CEOs of corporate America saying it's time to lead on climate policy and kind of making the environmental case as well as the business case for businesses to support ambitious action at the federal level, at the state level, at the sectoral level. Mm-hmm. And we boil down the essential leadership actions into three things. Advocate for policies that will get to net zero by 2050. Align your trade association's lobbying with that same net zero by 2050 goal, mm-hmm. and allocate your political spending to advance climate policies and not obstruct them. And because of all those things conveniently start with the letter A, we call this our AAA leadership framework. And it's really about having a science-based climate policy agenda mm-hmm. that matches your science-based targets.
And so that's incredibly positive that you got them to sign on to do that. Where are the areas or where are the sectors where you're looking for more action? Who would you like to see coming and joining that group?
Well, I think we've seen quite a bit of activity, especially recently on the Advocate pillar. Last year, 75 companies went to a Capitol Hill fly-in called Lead on Carbon Pricing. We're doing that again next year. We'd love to have companies come along again. You have the CEO Climate Dialogue that was formed and launched last May that is explicitly about advocating for federal climate policy according to a set of guiding principles that include market-based carbon pricing, equity, and durability, all kinds of things that are needed to support lasting success. Mm-hmm. And Climate Leadership Council that has a very specific policy solution that they're advancing. Those are really promising developments, and yet that's really a small minority of all companies that are out there that could be doing something. And so we'd like to see the majority of corporations step up and have a position on climate policy and be working mm-hmm. actively to advance it.
And I imagine some companies, when you approach them, they're like, this is a great idea, we believe it in principle, but there's so much conflict with their business models. Companies that have large emissions, that bringing them down in line with Paris is just so challenging. I imagine they push back and say, sorry, we just can't do this, we'll put us out of business. What's your response when you hear that kind of pushback?
Well, it's ironic. I think some of the companies that have been leaders in the space are actually the major emitters. And it's because if you look at the members of the CEO Climate Dialogue, companies like Dow and DuPont and BASF and Shell and BP, these are companies that know that the climate is changing. There will inevitably be a policy response. Mm-hmm. They'd like it to happen sooner rather than later, because the sooner that it happens, the more gradual it can be. The longer we delay, the more drastic and draconian the policy response needs to be. So I don't think there's a good rationale for major emitters to be staying away from this table unless they are just looking to maintain the status quo. And I just don't think anybody sees that as acceptable anymore. Not investors, not employees, not consumers. The climate is changing. We have to do something about it.
So let's just jump forward. Let's say 5 years from now, you've continued this work. It's been really successful. How do you think the political landscape has changed?
I think what's changed is companies are managing to a different level of leadership that includes not only their internal emission reductions, but what are they doing to advance policies that achieve those reductions economy-wide and worldwide that actually get us to our climate targets. I think what else has changed is the scorekeepers are using those same metrics of advocate, align, and allocate to measure leadership, whether it's reporting mechanisms or rankings or ratings for investors. The scorekeepers need to catch up to what the expectation is. Mm-hmm. I think the main stakeholder groups that companies care about, investors and students, are going to be expecting the same kind of leadership. So those are the changes that I anticipate, and I think we're really at an inflection point this year with all of these NGOs getting together and aligning on this message. We've put out a guide for companies now to the AAA framework of how do you do this? How do you implement it? What does leadership look like, and how can you get started? And that's available online and at our booth at GreenBiz.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really encouraging to hear of this kind of positive momentum on that front. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.